This is the second panel today, and I'm just going to begin by saying a few words of my own and then turn it over to the panel to introduce themselves, give them a little of their background, and then I'm going to invite each of them to say their beginning remarks, because I think that's where the high value is, and then we'll do some relation back and forth, some Q&A, and then finally turn it over to the audience as we were doing. I am James Gilmore. People know this. I'm the former ambassador to the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is headquartered in Vienna, Austria. They said to me, well, you know, if you deal with OSCE and you're dealing with 57 countries, you must know something about Syria. That's actually not accurate. The OSCE is 57 countries, but Syria is not one of them. There's actually a security partner group in the Mediterranean and Middle East that is in conjunction with the OSCE. We don't see them very much in that organization, but Syria is not part of that security partnership out of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. So this is a new day, and I would believe that at some point I would not be surprised if Syria doesn't have to make an application to at least be part of that group. One thing that being ambassador to that group gave me was an awareness of the big game that's underway globally right now with the introduction of big power competition between the United States, Russia, and China, and to some extent also Iran when you get over into the issue of the Middle East. And then, of course, North Korea is a big player in this on behalf of the Russians at the moment and the Asian challenges. But it's the big game. And I'm interested particularly in the role of the color revolutions, something that's been condemned by the Chinese President Xi and everybody else for that matter. But they seem to be emerging in the Arab Spring, in the Ukrainian situation, and all across the world. We're seeing, I think, people bubbling up and wanting to be free people against the authoritarians who actually pretend that they're Democrats and hold fake elections when in fact they're not that at all. So we are focusing now on Syria this morning. Let me add, by the way, my sympathies in the massacre that took place here in Washington, D.C. last night as what appears to be an unbalanced person, but certainly with a terrorist motive, a political motive. So I will add my sympathy to that. This panel, the theme of this panel is the race for nature abhors a vacuum, the race for influence in post-Assad Syria. And the first panel spent a great deal of time talking about the influence of Ahmed al-Sharaa. But what we do know is that this is a change in Syria right now that opens the door to a great deal of competition for using that territory for the furtherance of different people's interests. There's a great deal of discussion now that we've had today already about Turkey and the Kurds located in that area, the persistence of the ISIS and Islamic State type of people. Russia, which had a foothold definitely in Syria, both with ports and military reservations, which still exist. But it's pretty clear that Russia has taken a step back with the change of regime that we've seen there, and Assad moving, in fact, to Moscow, which I personally, based upon my experience at OSCE, see this as a glorious development. But it hasn't finished yet. The United States is a player in this now that we have seen that President Trump has met with Ahmed al-Sharaa himself and with the lifting of the sanctions. The president, I believe, places a great deal of emphasis in diplomacy and international relations on goodwill. And you see constantly he does things that are intended to develop goodwill. I think a lot of people, myself included, don't believe that that's enough and that national interests are what the focus should be on. But The president, I think, has developed an effort here towards goodwill. The Palestinian issue is there. The Israeli issue is there. Jewish population in Syria, as well as the southern border of Israel. And Iran, of course, is the big player here, and they have had to take a step back also. So the point of this conference, as I begin to think about turning this over to our panelists, is, where are we here? I'm tempted to say that Syria is the crossroads of the Middle East, but so is everything else. I mean, if you really look at it, everything that I just said, it's all crossroads of the Middle East. But this certainly is a central area now of major change, and we don't know where this is going to go. But we have excellent panelists here. Just the previous panel I thought was tremendously enlightening. This panel is just as good, and I'm delighted to have the people who are here. Michael Doran from the Hudson Institute. I might mention that I'm informed, Michael, that you're actually running your own conference, and nonetheless took time to be with us today, which I think is very valuable. Dr. Dawn Murphy of the National War College is here, and then you're going to tell me your own name.
Asli, that's the first name, and Aydıntaşbaş is the last name.
I can't hear.
Okay, Asli. Okay, Asli Aydıntaşbaş. Now try.
Now, you see,
Very good, everybody.
now you see why I didn't try to insult her by introducing her myself. Let's just get started with this theme, and then we can talk it over again after the presentations of the three persons. I'm going to simply go in the order in which Paul has listed them on the agenda, and then we will go from there. So let's start with Michael Doran. Michael, with the theme being the race for influence in post-Assad Syria. Frankly, there is a government there that I think has the prospects of being very helpful, but it's clear from my opening remarks, everybody else has their fingers in this pie too. Tell us what your thinking is about where we're headed here and where the influence in post-Assad Syria is going to end up.
Well, thank you very much. But before I say anything, I just want to say Asli Aydıntaşbaş. It just rolls right off the tongue.
Thank you, Michael.
Let me start with a worry I have, and then I'll answer the question directly. My analysis of Syria always begins with my experience I had. In 2005 to 2007, I was in charge of Middle East policy at the NSC. And we had back then an Iraq office because there was an Iraq war going on. And so the Middle East that I was responsible for was a big donut with a hole in the middle. But the hole was the part that was most important to the president, and that office was the most important office. And it saw the Middle East a little differently than I did. Because I thought the Middle East was a contest between our alliance system and Iran. And if you look at it that way, then Iraq is, of course, very important, but so is Syria. But I could never get senior leaders to notice Syria. And I thought at the time it was because of the Iraq war. There were a couple of times when I managed to get a paper in front of the president and other senior leaders, and they would agree that Syria mattered and change our policy. And then there'd be a long weekend, and I would come back. I'd go home and tell my wife, you know what, I actually influenced American foreign policy today. And then I'd come back from the long weekend, and all the counters would have gone back to zero. I thought it was because of the Iraq war, but I've been following this since, and the United States just doesn't see Syria. I believe it is the crossroads. The Middle East is itself a crossroads, but I believe that Syria is absolutely crucial for creating the new order that's going to emerge. But America, for all kinds of reasons, tends not to see it. And so my great hope is that the Trump administration will see it more than past administrations have. We'll have to wait and see if that happens. But in direct answer to your question, influence in Syria is in Ankara. This is President Erdogan is the big winner of the Syrian civil war. and there's just no escaping this. This is a hard fact. I saw yesterday or the day before that Tom Barrack, the new ambassador to Ankara, has also been designated the coordinator on Syria, and this actually makes an enormous amount of sense to me. If we want to do what is necessary in Syria to make Syria a success for the United States and also for the Syrian people, then we have to be closely coordinated with the Turks. I wouldn't say that they hold all the cards, but they hold 85% of them. So that's step one. And then my view after this is really very, very simple. America is pulling back from the Middle East. We're not leaving. That should be the top line message of President Trump's visit to the Gulf. We're staying in the Middle East. All the talk about pivot to Asia, we don't care about the Middle East, doesn't matter to us. This is nonsense. We care a lot for all kinds of reasons. We're going to stay there. But there's no appetite in the American public or even the national security elite for large military operations in the Middle East, which means we're gonna have to project power through our allies. We only have 2 allies in the Middle East who have the ability to project power beyond their border. They are Israel and Turkey. Those the Saudis can project influence, but they don't have hard military power that can really shape the military balance. The Turks and the Israelis can. Syria is, for all the other reasons that Syria matters, this is the place where our 2 key allies, our 2 key military allies, are butting up against each other. And so the job of the United States is to turn Syria into a buffer between those 2. The good news here is that in the last couple of days, it's been announced that through Azerbaijani mediation, there's now a deconfliction channel between the Turks and the Israelis. That's very, very good news. So I see a great trend. I see a few developments of the last couple of weeks that are very, very positive, I think. But I remain worried that the traditional American disinterest in Syria will take over.
What do you think the role of Iran will be going forward? You talked about Israel and Turkey, and I understand those 2 military powers, but there's also a military power in Iran, which seeks, through their own goals, to dominate the Middle East. That's been the thorn in American policy for years now. What's their role in the future of Syria, in your view?
They want to destabilize. They're really on the back foot. I mean, the great news about the Turkish position in Damascus now is that the Turks are natural counterbalances to the Russians and the Iranians. It doesn't mean they necessarily line up. Asli Aydıntaşbaş, I like saying your name. Asli Aydıntaşbaş will have more to say about this, but it doesn't mean that they line up directly with us on every policy. But just by their nature and their history, the Turks are a counterbalance to the Russians and to the Iranians. With regard to both of them, the Turks and the Russians and the Turks and the Iranians are just like oil and water. Not that they're fighting with each other, but where the Turks are, the Iranians are not. And with the Turks in Damascus now, when I say by proxy in Damascus, the Iranian land bridge from Baghdad to Beirut has been broken. Of course, the Iranians have been severely weakened by their war with Israel. Their Hezbollah has been hollowed out in Lebanon, and Iran's air defense system has been severely damaged, making all of Iran's most sensitive nuclear and military targets inside Iran are now naked before the Israelis. So right now they're just trying to buy time and get back in the game. But certainly what they want to do is prevent the United States from putting together a coherent arrangement between Israel and Turkey in Syria. So they would like to destabilize it, and they would like to do anything they can to bring Turkey and Israel into conflict in Syria. Unfortunately, the Turks and the Israelis, they've gotten closer thanks to some of our mediation. There's two channels of mediation going on between the Turks and the Israelis. One is on the auspices of CENTCOM. There's a Turkish liaison officer who sits in Doha and can liaise with the Israelis there. And the other is the mediation channel that the Azerbaijanis have been carrying out. And the Turks and the Israelis have gotten to know each other a little better this way, but they're basically don't understand each other and are not talking to each other. The Israelis have been reaching out and are dying to sit down with the Turks. I think President Erdogan's attitude, and this is my analysis, again, I'd be curious to hear what Asli Aydıntaşbaş, I'm going to say your full name every time, has to say about this. But I think President Erdogan doesn't want to cut a deal with the Israelis. Part of that is political because of the Gaza conflict. He doesn't want to be seen to be sitting down with the Israelis while Gaza is going on, and he knows that if he sits down with them, the Israelis will leak it in 2 seconds. So he doesn't want to do that. What he really wants is for the U.S. to deliver the Israelis. So he wants a negotiation with Donald Trump about the Israelis, and then the Americans deliver the Israelis, because that elevates him up to being the strategic interlocutor with the Americans, rather than down here negotiating with the Israelis, with the Americans kind of monitoring the whole thing. So the Israelis have been responding to the stiff arm by the Turks with military action in Syria, which is a statement to say, if you don't talk to us, we can shake up your project.
Well, now that's scene setting, if you will, in this new developments in Syria, and you've set the scene about where you think the things are today. I want to turn to Dr. Murphy, to Don Murphy. Don, if you would give us your thoughts about this question about the future of Syria. You certainly feel free to react to Michael's comments also, but give us just a couple of sentences about your background. I've introduced you as being part of the National War College, but if you could add a few things, then give us your thoughts.
Sure. So first, I need to give a disclaimer that the views that I expressed today are my own, and they don't represent the National War College, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government more broadly. My own background is my research looks at China, Middle East, China, Africa relations, and so my comments will be structured around that. I won't get into a deep dive. My bio is online if anybody wants to see it, but I'm really looking at it from a China perspective in my comments today. And really how I want to frame this, because I assume many of you may not be as familiar with China's interests or relations with Syria, I want to take a little bit of a step back and put this in some historical perspective, because I think we're at this inflection point in thinking through going forward, what will China's interests in Syria be? So the first thing that I would highlight, starting in 2011, so with the outbreak of the civil war in Syria, the main interest that China has in relations would be that they do not want conflict in Syria to spill over into a broader regional conflict, which any type of broader regional conflict would threaten China's economic interest in both resources and markets in the broader Middle East. So they don't want conflict. They also do not want material support for groups in Syria to be provided to the Uyghurs within China. I'll talk about this in more detail, but they have a lot of fears regarding those type of linkages. I would also note that their economic interests are incredibly limited in Syria, and overall their political interests are quite limited. I really think most of what drives their behavior are those first two items that I just described. So I'm going to focus on 2011 going forward, but one thing I want to say quickly is, even before 2011, one aspect of China's stance on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is that the Golan Heights should be returned to Syria. And they've had this stance for a very long time, but that's one aspect of interaction. But starting with the outbreak of the civil war in 2011, I think you're probably familiar, there were a number of vetoes that were double vetoes between Russia and China in the United Nations Security Council associated with Syria. Over time, there were 8 of those. Those tended to revolve around issues of Syria's sovereignty. And this is very much in alignment with China's broader stance in the international system, with a respect of sovereignty and a very skeptical view of sanctions and other types of intervention. That said, before 2011, China really hadn't been using its veto power regarding these issues in the Middle East. If you look historically back, they had been abstaining on issues such as this, but they weren't really using their veto power. So I would say really what changed with them deciding to veto is related to what occurred in Libya in 2011. So I think many of you are familiar. Before the NATO action in Libya with Libya's civil war, China abstained from a vote in the UN Security Council and arguably did not fully understand that that would pretty much give a green light for NATO interaction in the country, right? So they feel very burned associated with that. So you see from 2011 forward, them taking a stronger stand regarding sovereignty. And really, Syria was one of the first test cases of that. After China took these votes, you had a pushback in the early days of this from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in particular, very concerned regarding China's voting behavior on this. In 2012, you also had China contributing personnel to the United Nations peacekeeping operation that was the supervision mission in Syria. So they were participating in this way. And then in 2016, they actually established a special envoy for the Syria civil war. And the reason they did this was, first of all, they already had a special envoy dealing with the Middle East that was focused on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that had been operating since 2002. But when Syria occurred, more and more time of that special envoy was becoming involved in the Syria issue. So arguably they wanted to break this out so they could have an individual that was more focused on this. And really their concerns were, as I stated before, not wanting the Syrian civil war to spread, wanting to demonstrate that they're a responsible power. And what I mean by this, I already talked about when they voted in the UN Security Council with vetoes about Syria, the Emirates and Saudi and some other Gulf states were quite concerned about this. And so one way they responded to that was to demonstrate that they cared about Syria. They just didn't want to demonstrate that concern via the UN Security Council, but they wanted to have this special envoy. Another major focus of the envoy was on the Turkestan Islamic Party, TIP. So I mentioned this earlier, that you've got a situation where at this point you had, the numbers are not clear exactly, in open source type environments, but arguably what the Chinese were saying was that you had thousands of Uyghur foreign fighters in Syria, and that they were very worried about material support coming back in, or potentially Uyghurs coming back into China and fighting in various ways. Another interest that China had through this special envoy is that in the longer term, they want to contribute to humanitarian assistance and rebuilding of Syria in a post-conflict environment. And through the special envoy, they advocated for a political solution and a ceasefire, with a focus on counterterrorism as a major need in the country. And finally, in the special envoy, they really advocated for the use of multilateral mechanisms. So they supported the Geneva process, the Astana process, as well as the Vienna process. So that was the special envoy, right? And that was their approach. In 2023, China actually established a strategic partnership with Syria. And this was in the news. You probably didn't see it. It wasn't a big part of the news, right? But they did develop in 2023, long before the fall of Assad, a strategic partnership. What I want to mention here is that's important because it acknowledges that Syria is an important country in the region. But if you look across the Middle East, China has already established strategic partnerships with every single country in the region, except for 3. So the ones they don't have partnerships with right now are Israel, which that's labeled as an innovative partnership that actually right now they're in discussions with that being elevated to the strategic level. So you've got Israel, and then Yemen and Lebanon. are the only two countries throughout the broader Middle East that they don't have strategic partnerships with. So it's important, but it's not incredibly important. But I do want to note, since they did have that strategic partnership. So since the fall of the Assad regime last year, I would argue China's interests are exactly the same as they were before the fall of the Assad regime. They don't want conflict in Syria spilling over to the rest of the region. And they don't want material support for the Uyghurs coming in from TIP, which in the last month or so has actually renamed itself back to its original name, indicating the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Party, that arguably could indicate more of a focus on internal issues within China. So they have the same interests. They also, in particular, have been concerned that the Syrian opposition, which is now in a leadership role, actually contained Uyghurs, ethnic, Uyghurs that had come from Xinjiang, and that TIP, there were several commanders that are now officers in Syria's new defense ministry. So they've expressed concern about this. They've called for a Syrian-led transition. They continue to stress non-intervention and non-interference. I would argue they're looking for opportunities to economically engage with Syria because they think that economic development is one of the keys to eradicating terrorism and eradicating stability threats within the country. And I'll leave it at that. What I wanted to do was just give you an idea of, what are China's interests before and after the fall of Assad, and give you some food for thought going forward on what could China's stance be about Syria in the future.
I think that's a great broadening of the discussion that we've had already here today, and particularly with respect to what China's interests and goals are in the Middle East. This is the first I've heard about their concern about Uyghurs about fighting in Syria. It seems like everybody's fighting in Syria, but that's insight. And personally, I believe the American announcement of the pivot to Asia was one of the elements that caused the European war. So I'm interested in the long-term balancing of American policy, which I think tilted so far into the Pacific that you open the door in Europe. That's what I think. But all that's, and I'll just ask you one question before we turn to Asli. And my question is this: I was caught by what you said, that they have an interest in, or have stated an interest in, the Golan Heights being returned back to Syria. Well, they took that position when Assad was there. I wonder if they still will take it under the new regime. And was that driven by the idea that the return of territory somehow was analogous to what they're thinking about in Taipei, in Taiwan?
Okay. So the first part of this, the Golan Heights, together with China's broader stance regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is something that's been longstanding, going back many, many decades. So if you go back to the Mao era, China was actually providing material support to the Palestinians. Since 1992, they've had strong relations, state-to-state relations with Israel, but they've definitely had a Palestinian-leaning position. So they see the return of the Golan Heights as a broader kind of land for peace type of approach. I don't anticipate, given the continuity that they've had, both regarding that issue, but also if you think about October 7th and the ways in which their stance about the Palestinians has remained incredibly consistent before October 7th as well as after, I would anticipate the Golan Heights piece, it's regardless of the administration in place in Syria, that they would continue to have that stance, but we'll see. Regarding Taiwan, I see their stance on the Golan Heights and on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict more broadly. It's an interesting, it gets incredibly complicated in thinking about it in relation to Taiwan, because on one hand, they see both as unresolved territorial disputes from a long time ago, right, going all the way back to the 1940s. So I think in that way, they see analogies, but they do not tend to draw the analogies, explicitly. And I don't think of the analogies in kind of the broader international system. I don't think that's really the most important. I think that their stance on the Palestinians is driven much more by them conceptualizing the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as an ongoing, from their perspective, legacy of a national liberation movement in the way that they view Hamas, not having resolved that.
I think that the discussion is very broadening. I think Americans have a tendency to segment the world and so, well, we're in the Pacific, we're in Europe, we're in the Middle East. And, my view from the OSCE seat was that this is all global. This is all connected with the big picture of the change that these authoritarian countries are trying to bring into the world into the 21st century. So to connect your comments with the Middle East, with China, I think is a broadening and a very enlightening aspect of this. But let's turn now to Asli.
Yes, that's right.
Also, from the Brookings Institute, if you'd give us just a few sentences about your background and then give us your thoughts, I'd be grateful.
So I'm a fellow at Brookings Institution Foreign Policy Program, the director of the Turkey program, and prior to Brookings, I was at a European think tank for many years, European Council on Foreign Relations.
And tell us your thoughts about the theme here. But
Sure.
what is going to be the influence, the emerging influence in the new Syria?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about Turkey. But before I do that, I want to start out from where you started, talking about great power competition. We know that the old order is broken. It's gone. The type of world order that the United States has been upholding since World War II, what is roughly referred to as liberal international order, rules-based order, whatsoever, is gone. We don't know what the new order looks like. Is it going to be some version of the great power competition? Is it going to be a concert among great powers with zones of influence, or is it going to be some type of a modern day version of Middle Ages with lots and lots of regional orders and conflicts? We don't know that, but what we do know is that Turkey will be a key player in the 21st century. And I say that as someone who's often very critical of President Erdogan's domestic conduct, but the truth is that Turkey's ascendance and regional influence is almost without a doubt. And will probably outlive an Erdogan period. So this is a country that's been very much preparing for this moment in history for the past 20 years, working on what now Europeans are discovering, strategic autonomy, its own defense industrial base, building soft power and military power outside of its borders. These are all issues now Europeans are thinking, hey, wouldn't it be good if we kind of developed, strategic autonomy, started our defense industrial, guess what? Turks have been doing that. As a result, obviously, their influence in the Black Sea, to the north, sometimes in the Balkans, in Europe, definitely in the Caucasus, and down in Syria and Iraq. I'm sort of going around the sort of Turkish map here, and even in parts of the Middle East and Africa is just very clearly out there as in its military and economic footprint. Sometimes in a way that is a counterweight to Russia, sometimes in concert with Russia, sometimes in competition with China, sometimes in competition, in a competition with other players. But this is going to be a big, big opening for Turkey, 21st century. And there is a realization about that in the country, even outside of Erdogan and his circles, a sense of self-confidence that this period of a secular republic, nation state that was looking inward and didn't really want to mess with the people to the east, the Middle East, etc., is over, that it is the rebuilding of the Turkish Empire is very much a sort of a dominant theme. This has repercussions for regional countries from Armenia, Azerbaijan to others, but Syria is, of course, one place where Turkish leverage has been a key driver even of the domestic dynamics since the beginning of the war. Obviously, the HTS, the Ahmed al-Shara, the new regime, has been able to do what it did, overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad, in part because it was under Turkish protection. running a self-governing enclave on the Turkish border since 2017 with close economic and political relationship with Turkey. This doesn't mean they are, sort of Turkey's guys per se, but they are Turkey adjacent without a doubt. So the natural question is, what does Turkey want out of Syria, apart from sort of a power projection? But what is really the Turkish role in Syria? And I want to get to the really important issue that Mike has raised. What about Turkish-Israeli tensions? So Turkey wants out of Syria, first of all, a success story. It's not that they look at Syria and the glass is half full. They look at Syria and they see an enormous opportunity for Turkey, for Syrians, and something that can turn into a success story, and they're determined to make it a success story, using their political influence, economic influence, and if necessary, sort of transformative political power. They want Syria to retain its territorial integrity. When Turks look around their own neighborhood, they're worried about Kurdish independence. They're worried about Kurdish separatism, despite the peace process with Kurds, which is a very good idea, which I was supportive during the first peace process. I am supportive now. I hope that they can move forward. But it is true that Turks want to limit the kind of Kurdish autonomy you could see in Syria. They're okay with some type of an administrative autonomy, but they don't want an Iraq-like separate Kurdistan federal region. Whether they'll have enough influence over Damascus to be able to limit that, we're going to see. But I do think that they will have a big enough of a leverage to prevent a federalist solution, which in the previous panel, people have pointed out that Syrians are also the majority of Syrians, and mostly Arabs, very opposed to. So they want territorial integrity. They want security. They've been locked in this fight with the PKK for the past, people say in media 4 decades, but it's actually almost half a century, because PKK was founded in 1978 and now it's also an international organization with its offshoots in Syria, in Iraq, in Turkey, and in Iran. So while they want a peace process with Kurds and the PKK right now, it's very intertwined with the situation in Syria. They also do not want to see the kind of military power, Kurdish military power emerge under US protection. So they clearly want to limit that. I think they clearly want security and establish their own bases, military bases in Syria, in the way Russians did throughout the Cold War. They clearly want to, an economic success story with huge role for Turkey in reconstruction of Syria. So I think Turks have celebrated the recent decision by President Trump to lift sanctions on Syria. Not only did they see that as an unfair punishment of a society that has long been suffering, but also it's an opportunity for Turkey, because guess what? I mean, the moment you lift sanctions on Syria, and the moment somebody is willing to put some money, any money, into Syria, whether it's to open a bakery or build a road or open a bank, who's going to benefit from it? Who's the country that has the means and the ability to actually do the contracts and build the roads and open a bank and the branch of a bank and build the energy grid, etc.? There's only one country in the region that can do that. And so they're aware that any opening for Syria is an opening for Turkey economically. They don't want Iran or Russia in Syria, no doubt about that, even though they have this weird relationship where they manage these powers and they don't want a confrontational stance. They do not want Russians in Syria. They're being cautious, so they don't want to alarm, they don't want to be too provocative, too alarming, too combative with Russians until the war, as long as the war in Ukraine is raging, but they ultimately want Iran and Russia out of Syria. And so I think that while they've had a very close relationship with the government of al-Shara and broadly support U.S. goals for a more inclusive regime in Syria, yes, they do want Shara to understand that he can't run Damascus as a jihadist. Turks understand that. But they're not going to push him too hard. But ultimately, they also have some comfort in knowing that if Shara doesn't work out, the next Shara will also likely be Turkey's guy. So I'm fundamentally, maybe they are worried about Israeli-Turkish rivalry, regional influence, and for influence over Syria has been a very destabilizing factor. I think Turks see Israel as a destabilizing actor at this point in the Middle East. I know that I am supportive of deconfliction and Turkish-Israeli dialogue to sort of end this very perilous course. You've had a situation in which in Syria, Turks decided to set up a military base near Palmyra, and Israelis went ahead and bombed the area just sort of the day before Turks are to arrive. I mean, it could have been a situation in which Israelis bombed, Turkish people, Turkish engineers or military personnel, whatever. So this is quite dangerous. But I think time is on Turkey's side in the sense that Israelis are bound to understand that their policy of destabilizing Syria is not something that's good for Israel's security long term. Here you have a country that says, as an Arab country that fought, Israel for decades, I want to establish better relations with Israel. I think Israelis have to take a win and understand that they have a party they can communicate with in Damascus at this point.
Now, all that is great new insight for this discussion. I, for one, when I was ambassador in Vienna, the residence of the OSCE ambassador in Vienna was on a street called Türkenschanstraße. And when I got there, I said, what does that mean? It is the farthest location of Turkish influence into Europe during that time. And my experience of going down into the Balkans and into Eastern Europe was they want no part of Turkey. It's funny, Americans think about what happened last month. Europeans think about what happened 500 years ago. And it's just an amazing, different way of thinking. But the insight that I've gotten from the panel is Turkey's influence and future rests south into Syria in dealing with the Israelis, with all of this area. I think that's great insight from this panel. Michael, do you have any thoughts about what you've heard from both of these ladies?
Just add a couple more things on the Turkish role here. Another factor in the Turkish interest is to return the refugees from Turkey from Syria that are in Turkey. There are millions there. I think the Turkish government officially says 3 million, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Mm-hmm. It's many more than that, and the Turkish maternity wards are full of Syrian women having babies. And the average Turkish woman in her lifetime has, 1.3 children, something like that. And the average Syrian woman has, 5.6, something like that. So it's a real issue for President Erdogan, just like it is for all Europeans, all of the Syrian refugees. And President Erdogan took a very principled position in the last election where he was under pressure to say that he was going to return the refugees, and he said, "We won't do it. We won't do it until they can go home safely." But they would like them to go home. That's why the policy of lifting the sanctions is so important, because they don't right now. There's no economy to go home to. I visited Syria just after the fall of Assad, and although I had seen all of the YouTube videos of the destruction, I was still shocked by it, because we drove from Gaziantep down to Damascus 6 hours, and it was 6 hours of just total destruction. And going through these towns and villages and watching women picking over piles of clothing that had been dropped off by humanitarian aid workers and so on. And it was a level of destruction that, although I knew it existed, if you just see nothing but that for 6 hours, it's really shocking. So those people can't go home unless there's some kind of economic security and economic reconstruction. But there is another element here, which is, again, Asli is probably in a better position to talk about this than I am, but Syria is in Turkey now. Erdogan would like them to go back. They're not all going to go back. And Syria is now in Turkey in a way that it hasn't been historically, I mean, since World War I. And Turkey built a Syrian army. The Syrian National Army is a Turkish-run Arab army. So there are now organic connections and ideological connections as well between the Syrians and the Turks that never existed before, or that that in our living memory didn't exist. I don't know how this. I'm just pointing it out. I don't have a clear idea of how it unfolds, but it's important to remember when you look at the Israeli fears. I was actually quite shocked by the degree to which the Israelis were not ready for a Turkish dominance in Syria. I said before about how Americans don't see Syria. Weirdly, the Israelis didn't see it either. They didn't see Turkey. I was in Jerusalem just before Assad fell, and then shortly after. And the Israelis were absolutely stunned by the rise of Turkey on their border, and didn't know how to think about it, and didn't know how to deal with it. I think they've done and didn't know a lot about what was going on the ground in Syria. They have a target list of threats in Syria, but really understanding the dynamics on the ground, they did not understand well. I think they've done a massive tutorial in the last in the last few months, but their concern, and I don't think it's fanciful. President Erdogan in the last few months has prayed to God for Israel to be destroyed. He's told groups that we can look forward to Turkish soldiers liberating Jerusalem. Be patient, I think he said, when they asked, when will we go to Jerusalem? We've gone to Damascus, when will we go to Jerusalem? Be patient, give it time. He's repeatedly accused Israel of genocide, and he is supportive of Hamas as a liberation organization. So the Israelis have reason to be concerned. My argument with them is that Turkey is bigger than Erdogan's statements. The Turks' number one concern really is their border security and the PKK question. They want economic growth, all the things that Asli said, I totally agree with. And there's a whole set of pragmatic concerns. But the Israelis tell me, and I have no reason not to believe them, that the Turks planned to turn Syria into one big Turkish military base. And that's the crux of the argument. And that's where the United States has to play a mediating role, I think. That's the key question. Everything that the Turks want in Syria, the Israelis want for Syria, except that last bit. They don't want they want an independent Syrian government that's taking care of its own security, and not a forward base of Turkey, and especially a Turkey that is calling for, in one way or another, for the destruction of Israel.
Dawn, I came into this discussion thinking that the Syrian developments were going to affect the great power competition between Russia, Iran, the United States. That's what I thought. And what I'm learning from both of these panels today is the dominant position of Turkey in this discussion. But now, from your point of view, what do you believe there's a possibility here that the Israelis, the Turks, the Iranians are going to end up tearing this country to pieces and making it a battleground, if you will, that's going to continue to destabilize the Middle East? I don't know that China has any role in that, but what's your reaction to what you've heard? There's still time not only for you, but also for Asli to have some more to say.
Understood. And I think on that question, probably Asli has more to say. I've got a few comments, though, to react to what they've said so far. Indeed, it relates to Turkey's rising influence. So one interesting dynamic is, as Turkey's influence is rising, if you look throughout the Middle East, of the countries in the Middle East, you could argue that Turkey's relations with China are some of the most tense. It doesn't exist tense. And a lot of this comes from the fact that the Turkish people share an ethnicity with the Uyghurs. And so when you look at popular opinion, there's very much a tension point. I think that the government of Turkey manages this quite effectively, but the underlying public opinion in Turkey, so if you put that on top of Turkish influence in Syria, and then also combine that with, as was said earlier, with al-Shara, it appears in many ways he's governing in a different way. But if you move towards a bit more of a radical approach towards China with concern about the Uyghurs and all of that combined with the Turkish influence, you could potentially in the longer term have more strained relations between Syria and China, which would limit the ability of China to have much influence. On the lifting of sanctions, I think it's a really interesting question in relation to China, because, as I said, also, China wants to be involved in the reconstruction. And so is that an area where Turkey would see that as a complement, that the more countries, the better in that space to reconstruct? Or will they see that as a competition that Chinese businesses potentially are taking opportunities away from Turkish businesses? I don't know how that would play out, but it has interesting implications for Turkey-China relations.
Well, what I think that most of the thinking is right now is that China uses its economic power to gain its influence into places where it goes in order to do reconstruction and the Belt Road Initiative and so on like that. So that might be the concern that Turkey has up the road, that China will gain influence. And if you said that there's tension between China and Turkey, then that plays a role in all of this. Asli, what do you think about what you've heard from the other two panelists here today, from Michael and Don?
Yeah, I agree with Mike that Israelis have some reason to be concerned, but not so about Turkey and sort of some of the very anti-Semitic stuff that's coming out of President Erdogan's mouth, let's face it. But they are wrong to, I think their understanding of Turkey is being a little bit black and white, and of all the countries in the region, they should know Turks best because they have been in a very close relationship with Turkey for the past several decades. And the truth is, Turkey, even Erdogan, does not have an existential opposition to Erdogan. I think he's obsessed with Gaza, and Turkish public is very outraged about Gaza and what's happening in Gaza. There's no doubt about that, and there will not be a normalization as long as people are dying in Gaza. On the other hand, Turkey does, unlike Iran and unlike some of the other regional countries, I think Turkey does not have an existential quibble or a problem with a Jewish state that is a significant regional power. In fact, we know that historically Erdogan has had, at times a good relationship with Israelis, and the Palestinian issue has always been the litmus test in this relationship. Whenever things got tense in the West Bank, even in pre-Erdogan times, Turks felt responsible for what was happening, and it's been a strain on Turkish-Israeli relationship. So hopefully at some point this war winding down, and perhaps with the possible changes of government in Israel, there is an opportunity for a normalization, with or without Americans. But I agree with you that the United States has to be the mediator here, because that's the traditional role it has played. I am maybe under China, and Turkey is bigger than Erdogan, but post-Erdogan Turkey, even under CHP, would also have problems with what's happening in Gaza. You know, there would be a sort of a spat and an escalation there. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to result in a military confrontation, which is what we need to understand, especially not over Syria. I think that China issue, interesting, would Turks oppose Chinese interest in Syria? I think that is very far down the road, because Syria would not be a priority for China, and they're not even being as flexible as the Russians are right now, who are kind of like sending delegations to Damascus and wanting to establish. So Chinese are very doctrinal about this, and are not going to help the Syrian regime. But if they were to decide to invest, I don't think it would be a huge worry for Turkey, because they have no way of influencing the political discussion in Syria. And Turks don't see it. They don't see Syria through counterterrorism. They see it as a next door story that is now, whose destiny is now intertwined with Turkey's own fortunes, and they, and in that nothing's going to change that. No amount of Chinese money to build whatever bridge is going to change that outcome in Syria. So whereas there are other parts of the world, including in the Caucasus, where they're more competitive, in parts of Africa where they're more competitive with the Chinese, I think this is a case in which Chinese predatory economic practices are not likely to have an impact on the political outcome.
Well, look what we're all talking about here. We're really talking about Turkey and its future and its influence into this vacuum that was described. I think that what we're laying out here is the challenge that Ahmed al-Sharaa is going to have when trying to actually set up a whole new government and a whole new role, as opposed to being battered around by others. I think with the Israeli conflict going on, that kind of instability that's going on right now, I wonder if that's going to spill over, as has been described, into Syria. I think the Israelis have plenty on their plate with their doing that, but I am particularly interested in the battle going on in the United States right now, as to whether or not we're going to be pulling back from places all over the world and letting the world take care of itself, or whether we're going. My view is that America's interests rest with its internationalization. I believe allies are essential to the United States, and I warned David Hale, who's over here. I'm going to ask him about that at the luncheon speech about the conflict within the United States, because it has a direct bearing on Syria and the Middle East. If the U.S. pulls away from that, then the question then is, where are we going to have? Are we going to have stability in Syria, or is it going to be a place of instability with the war in the south and the interest of Turkey in the north? Why don't we give each of you an opportunity to sum up your thinking about this based upon the conversation that we've had, so as we begin to move towards the close, Phil, of our second panel. And I must say that I think that the two panels together today have been enormously enlightening about the Syrian situation, which is in the news all day today. But I know I've learned a lot about it from these panels that I didn't come to the table with when I started this panel. So why don't we do a summary statement, if you would. Why don't you start with Michael, and we'll keep in the same order. Do you have anything to add?
I just want to know which panel was best.
Oh, no, my panel is always best. That's a rule.
I'll just give you a picture of what I would like American policy to be.
Oh.
And is everything all right?
I overlooked something, but hold that back, if you will. Keep that thought. My trusty executive directors reminded me that we should go to Q&A within the room. Are there questions here among the ambassadors in the room? And there are at least 4. So why don't we move forward? That we still have a few minutes. Let's start at the back, Phil, and then take you last, if we could, please, John.
John Wacolta. So you have talked quite a bit about policy and the thoughts of all of the leadership over there in the Middle East, but I'm a more pragmatic-looking person, and I take a look at the enormous destruction that has taken place in both Gaza, which I was in May of last year with the former National Security Advisor, and was astonished to see out of 300,000 structures, 250,000 are completely destroyed. And the estimates for a rebuild, take your guess, $50 billion, $100 billion. And now you have Syria, and I've not been there and haven't seen any of the YouTube videos, but the way you described it, it sounds to me the equivalent or probably even worse than Gaza is today. And so with that in mind, and all of these new policy ideas, how does this tens of millions of refugees survive and show that there's some kind of a pathway, a Marshall Plan? Because I've heard from at least the country that I served in that they have some very, very strict conditions before they're going to put any money into recovery. And when you think about the totality of the size of this, it just seems to me that we're so out of whack that there really isn't any pathway forward, at least for the tens or 20s of millions of people that need that kind of infrastructure improvement, housing, whatever it might take. So have either your organizations come upon any estimates of how much it's going to cost to fix these places? And number 2, who's going to pay?
Any response to that from the panel?
I don't.
I have some thoughts in the direction. I don't have a really good answer for you. If we're just talking about Syria, I think we are talking about a monumental effort, and probably anything that is done is not going to be adequate to totally rebuild the country anytime quickly. But the Gulf countries are eager to. They do have a lot. The Qataris, for example, already went to Sharjah and wanted to start rebuilding his electric grid, which is a crucial first step to rebuilding. They ran afoul of, he said basically, give the money to my brother, this wasn't going to pass muster with us, and so on. So the U.S. policy of lifting sanctions on a rolling basis, I think it offers an opportunity for the United States to become the leader of a coalition that includes European powers, all the World Bank, the Gulf powers, to come up with a general plan forward. And of course, it will be done in close coordination with the Turks, who stand to benefit from this in any manner of ways, both in terms of stability on their border, solving the threat from the PKK, but also building their own economy. And there's a domestic Turkish economic benefit here. And I think we saw that convergence of economic interests or of interests in President Trump's visit to the Gulf, where both the Turks and the Saudis were singing the same song. There's no love lost between Mohammed bin Salman and President Erdogan. But both of them basically presented the same picture of Syria to President Trump, and he bought it. So that, to me, I don't know that the combined investment that can generate will be fully adequate to the task, but it will take us way into a much better place than we are now, much, much better, and it will open up opportunities for the efforts of the Syrians themselves to propel things forward. That coalition, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and Turkey, working under an American umbrella together with the Europeans, is really quite an opportunity. I think something very different than we've seen in the Middle East for a long time.
Next question. Jim. Phil, I'm going to take you last. Fearless leader, we'll take you last. Jim.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to China for a minute in terms of the great power. I don't really understand why, you touched on it, but I'd like a little more. Why do they care? I mean, they got a lot of things to do in the world, a lot of dangers and a lot of opportunities. How does this fit into their worldwide agenda?
Right. And so first of all, I'm not saying it's an incredibly high priority for them, but the reason they care is I think they do think, as opposed to other conflicts around the world, that this conflict that now is not in active conflict mode, but that if you had Syria, because of all of the external powers that are involved in it and the ways in which that could have become a major regional conflict or in the future could, I think they worry about that because Syria is not important, but oil from Saudi is and oil from Iran, and they see the Middle East broadly as one of an incredibly important economic partner. That's part of it, but also the terrorism angle. So I talked about the links with the Uyghurs, but also the degree to which you have terrorism that then ultimately ends up targeting Chinese businesses or citizens, whether it be in Syria or in other countries, but that Syria serves as a breeding ground. I think they're worried about that. But I do think those are the main concerns.
Can I just add to that? Maybe this is obvious, but Dawn didn't say it, but it's implicit in everything she's saying. Shara has a significant contingent of foreign jihadis in his military, and there is a Uyghur component there. And the Turks are not going to he's not going to send them home, and the Turks are not going to send them home. And that means that the Chinese are always looking at that with great concern.
How about that? Next question. Richard, and then we'll close with Phil.
Sorry about that.
That's great. Yeah.
I can normally make myself heard without the microphone, but I will indulge our people who are watching on Zoom. Dr. Murray, I spent a fair amount of time in Xinjiang, China some years ago, and was struck by the degree to which the Han Chinese were afraid of the Uyghurs. I had a chance to have dinner with the governor and asked their view of ISIS and of Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism. And I didn't get a straight answer, one would expect to. His translator gave one answer, my translator corrected him. My translator and I discussed this later. I got the impression they were confident they could buy off the problem. Do you agree?
So when was the visit? Was it recently?
In Urumqi.
In Urumqi, but what year was the visit?
Would have been 2013, 2014.
Right. And so what's interesting is the timing of that, because the way I was going to respond to this is I think Chinese leadership has had a worry about Uyghurs and terrorism in Xinjiang for a long time, going back decades. But starting right after the Arab awakening, you started to see, at least from my perspective, an exaggerated and unjustified fear, but this growing fear. There were a number of very high-profile terrorist incidents that occurred, including the bombing that occurred right under Chairman Mao's portrait at Tiananmen Square. And so you take what was happening with the Arab awakening, together with that, I think internally you started to have this real fear. It was kind of not too long after 2014, you started having the camps built in Xinjiang, and obviously they were taking actions in that way. But whether you look internally within China or globally, their concerns about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, I think, have been increasing over time associated with that. And, they've had a number of Chinese citizens that have been targeted in terrorist attacks globally, right? So I think it's growing. So I wonder if you asked the same official today, if he would agree or not, or if you had asked him maybe in, let's say, 2017, when they were actively, because I think you can argue now, and I think you guys are all familiar with the fact that there hasn't been as much reporting on what is happening in Xinjiang, but the camps still exist. Millions of people are still being held in extrajudicial camps in Xinjiang, right? So the problem continues as far as the Chinese leadership's concerned, but they may argue today that they've taken care of, because a lot of the arguments they make is since those high-profile cases in 2014, they have not had terrorist incidents within their own borders, so they are arguing that their policies have been effective. I do not agree with that. I am deeply concerned with the treatment of Uyghurs within their own borders, but thank you for the comment.
I've run us over a little bit, but let's close with Phil's question, and I was so focused on what they were saying that I neglected the Q&A. So Phil, if we close.
That's all right. I hope that this will be an intelligible question, and it's directed to Asli Aydıntaşbaş.
Very good.
We all, well-intentioned and not selfish actors, all, I think, agree that the last thing we would like to see evolve out of this transitional and unsettled situation in Syria is the restoration of some other brutal, dictatorial, death-dealing, Assad-like regime to emerge somehow from this period. The people who might not share that objective are the people who are the losers in this, and we made a list of losers. At the top of the list are Iran and Russia, who are not known for their humanism. So, with Turkey's vast influence, Asli, here, what's Turkey's model of how to prevent those losers from getting their way, partly by reinstalling or helping to reinstall some kind of brutal Assadist-type regime, because Turkey doesn't want that either, you've told us. What's their method for assuring that doesn't happen, short of making Syria, in all but name, another province of Greater Turkey? Exactly what the Israelis won't tolerate.
What kind of an order would Turkey like in Syria?
That's another way of putting it more shortly.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is still a work in progress, but I do think that they are very inspired by sort of the intellectual currents around neo-Ottomanism these days. And to the extent that they want a Pax Turkica around Turkey, I would say it is a representative democracy of sorts, but not a liberal democracy. So some type of a majoritarianist rule where there's elections and a competitive landscape. But, you know, one that has authoritarian rifts, one that has authority, just like Turkey, one that has illiberal instincts. So, you know, whereas, you know, 2 decades ago, Turkey was seen as this model of Europe's transformative power and a Muslim democracy. Today, it is still a democracy of sorts. It's not Russia, it's not Iran, but there is an illiberal feel to it. So if you do have elections, you do have competition, you do have opposition winning, you have a very robust parliamentary debate. But if you're fighting for LGBT rights, it's tougher for you in Turkey. And I think that Syria is going to be a place in a similar fashion, a bit more of a majoritarian Sunni regime, where you will have a representative democracy that will be under checks and balances through governance system. But I think it's going to be harder for those that advocate a liberal democracy. It may not be hard for minorities because the Ottoman millet system was not necessarily, you know, as tough as on minorities as it was in the late 19th century, with sort of where you know, the Ottomans had issues with Greeks and Armenians and Christians and so on. So those were, you know, the modernization has brought in nationalism that was at the heart of some of these conflicts. So I do think that it's a work in progress. Turkey is not going to push them. And I don't see an international actor to push them towards policies for more of a liberal democracy. You know, I don't even think that the United States will do that. I mean, there's a desire to see a more representative government, which Turkey is pushing, but there's not going to be, you know, the kind of liberal push that we've used to seeing.
Michael?
Well, I guess we better guard against the players all in that area, of which there are at least a dozen, trying to throw the nation-building obligation onto us
Well,
And we ought to make sure that doesn't happen.
I was going to say that what Asli described would be called in Putin's Russia guided democracy, and in this case, the guide, it sounds like, would be Turkey.
I don't think Turkey is Russia. It is the Turkish democracy is obviously experiencing a big democratic deficit, a backsliding, but there's also a pushback from society. You've seen demonstrations, you've seen the outrage. So, these are things that don't really happen in Russia. And I don't want to say there's nothing redeemable about what's happening right now, but it's also a hybrid model that is very indigenous and will probably always be the case.
This has been a very sophisticated panel, and I want to thank all three of you for participating today and giving us the benefit of your insights. Thank you very much for the chance.
Sure, of course.
And I have a ministerial duty to perform, if you would, and that is to give each of our panelists a token of our appreciation. And since each of you is actually, I think, new to us as a presenter, that will be lonely on your shelves until we invite you back. A couple of the previous panelists have been able to add that to a collection. We're going to go next door for a luncheon, which will be addressed by our former Undersecretary for Political Affairs, David Hale, who himself has held several embassies in the Middle East. But before we give a vote of thanks here to both the panelists and also to Paul and to Eleanor in the back, who've been indispensable to organizing our conference today, and to Jim for moderating the second panel, I just want to point out to you, if it's not too self-serving, what we've done this morning. This doesn't matter necessarily very much to those of you who are from far away and out of town from Washington, because this probably is not something that you keep score on. But in Washington, where public policy is everything, the public policy think tank game is something that we do kind of keep score on, especially since think tanks have different character. There's some that are more conservative, some that are more liberal, some that are heavier on domestic policy, some that are heavier on foreign policy. But this morning we have heard from the Middle East Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Atlantic Council, the Hudson Institute, the National War College, and Brookings. There are very few places in Washington where you will have the opportunity to have such a cook's tour of the various tendencies, specialties, and talent and knowledge of our policy community, if you would. So, as if you hadn't realized that you'd received a rich repast this morning, you had a very rich repast. So now let's go have a repast in the dining room.